Welcome everybody. I hope you're fine. At least in Berlin, it is quite fine concerning the weather, so I hope it's good at your side too. Welcome to the third one of this webinar series concerning towards European data spaces. This time a little bit more dedicated to semantics in medicine, which is quite important, as you know, of course. Well, I'm the chair of the ELO group. For those who do not know what ELO means EHTEL-like organization, which is nowadays a little bit translated to the e-health competence centers in the member states. And therefore, I'm, well, one of the chairs. The other one is, I think, not there yet. The other one is Vesa Jomalainen from THL from Finland. And we both normally host ELO meetings if they are in person, and somewhere in Europe we normally met once a year. Well, this year is of course different. Coming back to the ELO meeting, we normally tend to discuss actual topics, actual problems, actual challenges, and of course very interesting things. For example, if they come out from a project. And this is, I think, one of the things we discussed today, or at least get presented today, looking in the webinar. So what's inside UNICOM? As already said, where we have some also German guests who will go into the details of that. But I guess concerning the agenda, you all have seen the agenda. I hope you can follow us completely. Looking back on the slide, you now see, of course, it's quite important to know that semantics interoperability is one of the key things, if not the most important one, if you avoid to want to get a patient wrongly treated by a medication. Nevertheless, if he's abroad or at home. So, and therefore it's quite important, and concerning patient safety is one of the biggest things to discuss. Of course, you know that medication in Europe is far away from being interoperable concerning the naming of drugs and products and all that, but I guess we go into the details within this webinar a little bit more. I do not know if you all see the agenda now. Well, I see it now, but I guess I can hand over to Stefan, who is setting the scene, so concerning who is in the agenda, who is presenting today.
For setting the scene, yes, I guess you have noted our agenda. I will introduce the presentations when they come. We have a nice spectrum of starting with data reuse, semantic interoperability, and data quality. Coming back to the details, for what I have prepared under setting the scene is a small presentation, just rehearsing the two webinars that we all already had. And now, since I said it like this, I will also switch off my camera so you can move the presentation at full screen if you wish. I'm also a member of the EHTEL team, as you might know, and in this role I'm supporting since many years the ELO network, now also since many years jointly with Andreas. So our first two meetings, they are all under this headline, as you have seen, towards European health data spaces. And we had two webinars in May and in June. And we started first with the European Strategy for Data, which has been released in February 2020. And you will see here with this link, if you have the presentation later on, that based on particularly the first webinar, EHTEL has contributed to the European consultation on the data strategy. And if you click here, you will find the details. The European health data spaces are foreseen as implementing this strategy for health to leveraging opportunities for better healthcare based on better research. And this also means helping citizens to better control their own data, establishing fair data sharing models, etc. And here, and you will find a reference where you can read this in more detail. Here you see the 4 pillars where measures are foreseen: data governance and rules, data quality, which we will focus on today, infrastructure and technology, and very important is capacity building and digital skills, particularly now in the times of COVID-19, where everything has to be done. Much more has to be done by digital means. So here, a perspective on the member states. We had at the first and the second webinar, we also had presentations, that's in a way of use cases. And you see here, just as a color for this patch more or less, the example of FinData in Finland, which is a front runner in the legislation. We had seen Denmark, where quickly the infrastructures and services have been adopted to serve COVID-19 purposes, but you see also here that moving towards nationwide health data ecosystems is now, let's say, kind of a trend or a shared national strategy. You see here examples of the French health data hub and the national interoperability platform for Austria. So this is becoming a movement where interoperability legislation and health data spaces are in a way part of a convergence process. Then we had also as a guest the International Data Spaces Association, which collaborates with EHTEL in the OpenDEI project. And you see here an example of a digital ecosystem which is focusing particularly on maintaining the data sovereignty. And IDSA is also a very interesting player, as it is one of the founding partners of the European Gaia-X platform. Last but not least, at the second webinar, we had a presentation by Interoperate under the headlines of architectures and processes enabling data reuse. And Interoperate has a motto putting data in people's hand. And here you see that there's a research protocol, and without sharing any details, here the patient gets the opportunity to share the data which he has with him in his data container on a smartphone, to give it targeted for health research studies, which is also one of the routes to the European health data spaces. So all this is mostly available for rehearsal and reading. There are 2 fact sheets. One is already published on the website. The second one, more or less in reverse order, is still in internal review, but also will be up soon. And our 2 already, the earlier webinars have both been recorded and edited. And once you have the slides, you can click on those links and access the full webinar recordings, or you also find it directly, of course, in the EHTEL website. So with this quick tour, I'm coming back to today. You see here our line of webinars. And today we are here at the European Data Spaces for Medicines. And without any delay, we will now move over to the presentation of Professor Miriam Stockenboom. And she actually she has to apologize in person for today, which came as a surprise early morning, given some local duties. And Miriam is a pharmacist at the University of Groningen, and has been also educated as an epidemiologist at the Harvard School of Public Health, and is a professor in pharma epidemiology. Currently, she's working at the Julius Center, Global Health Group in University Medical Center at Utrecht. She is part of the UNICOM project, where you will learn much more. And she has prepared a presentation, Wide Use of Real-World Medication Data Routes for European Data Spaces. Miriam has kindly recorded this as a YouTube stream.
Good afternoon, and I'm privileged to present to you a lecture on wide use of real-world medication data in Europe and its challenges. I apologize I cannot be with you live, and that's why I have recorded this presentation. My name is Miriam Sterkebom. I'm working with the Institute of Health Data for UNICOM, and I'm also have an affiliation with the University Medical Center Utrecht as a professor in real-world evidence. So the outline of the presentation today is first to talk why do we need big data and collaboration to evaluate medicines. Subsequently, I will talk about two examples. First, the Safety of NSAIDs project, which ran between 2009 and 2014, and then an example from the IMI ADVANCE project that is about vaccines. Then we will talk a bit about the conception common data model, and then we'll draw conclusions. So there's clearly a large need to use big data to evaluate medicines. And I think 2004 was a pivotal year when Vioxx was actually voluntarily withdrawn from the market after 5 years of marketing, because it had been shown in a clinical trial that the use of rovacoxib could increase the risk for myocardial infarction. This led to the fact that this took 5 years and millions of people to be exposed prior to detecting it led to a review of the Institute of Medicine of the pharmacovigilance system. And they concluded that the way medicine safety was being evaluated should drastically change. In that review process, Richard Platt from Harvard Pilgrim Healthcare had calculated that if electronic healthcare data would have been available with at least 1 million subjects, that the association between rovacoxib and myocardial infarction could have been detected in 3 months. And this was the start of what is currently known as the Sentinel system, where indeed electronic healthcare data on 100 million people are actually being utilized to monitor safety for the FDA. And this is all funded through FDA and put in law by the FDA Amendment Act. In Canada, in 2013, the CNOTS project was set up and paid for by Health Canada, also to monitor medication safety, and it's actually a collaboration between the Canadian provinces that have very similar type of data, so it's actually quite good to pool them. In Europe, there was also a notion that collaboration should happen and that people should not conduct their own database anymore, but that you should actually be able to work together across projects or across databases. And the first attempt to do this was done in the EU EHTEL project, which was set up to be able to use electronic healthcare data to detect safety signals. And it used distributed analytics and a common data model. Subsequently, there were several formal medicines evaluation studies requested by the European Medicines Agency to look at class effects and, or the safety issues related to an entire class of drugs. Then afterwards, and that period, we also had the pandemic, the H1N1 pandemic, and subsequently many studies have been conducted, and the evaluation or the evolution of methods and tool has continued. So let's look at one of a good example. So the first example I would like to share with you is the example on the evaluation of traditional NSAIDs and coxibs and their risk of cardiovascular disease and upper GI bleeding. If you're interested in any of the publications around this with the data, so here you can actually find that. In the SOS study, 7 data sources participated, 3 from Italy, 2 from the Netherlands, Germany, and UK, together having access to a source population of about 35 million subjects using various type of data from medical record databases such as IPSI and THIN and PDNet to claims databases such as the SISR and the OSIF and the BIPS database, and then a record linkage of different type of data in Pharmo. Now what you see on the right-hand side is actually the terminology by which the diagnoses are being coded. So you could see several use ICD-9, there is ICD-10 in Germany, READ in the UK, and ICPC in the Dutch general practice database. The model that was set up actually in the EUDR system that has been used for about 10 years across many different studies and about 40 different publications, I think is a quite simple common data model. On the top you see 3 files, and the local data access providers will need to put their data into this format. So in these 3 input files, a prescriptions file, an events file, and a population file. And then they can actually apply a program. And in this instance, it was Jerboa, but you can also run SAS or R. And the results of that program are actually being shared. And in this way, background rates could be calculated, incidence rates of events during use or case control studies and drug utilization studies. What you see here in the events table is actually an event type, which means that these files are both structurally, syntactically we call that, and semantically harmonized in some way. And the biggest issue in many of the initial studies was how to harmonize the event type, and especially if you saw the different terminologies that we were just looking at in the source data. Medicines were harmonized at ATC level. And so they were less of a problem because this was mostly available in most as a common terminology in many of the databases, except in the UK databases where they needed to map it to ATC from the BNF code. And then people would use their own procedure to calculate the duration of a prescription. So most of the initial hurdles were actually in how to deal with the heterogeneity in diagnosis recording, and especially in Europe, because in the US everybody uses ICD-9 and they use very similar type of data sources, both in the US and Canada. So especially in Europe, where we have all the different terminologies and languages, this was an issue. So within the EUDR project, there was an initial approach to harmonization of events, and this is the key publication you see listed here from Paul Avila, who is currently working at the Harvard Medical School. And it's based on the use of the Unified Medical Language System, which is a meta-thesaurus actually that allows linkage to the different terminologies. Now, within this paper, there is a stepwise process, like 6 steps that would bring you from the case definition to the final list of codes that you would need to actually identify events in a data source. Now, here you see an example of the complexity of what it can be from the SOS project that I used as an example. So in the SOS project, we had 4 outcomes. Upper GI bleeding, acute myocardial infarction, stroke, and heart failure. And there were 41 confounders that needed to be considered, and there was 1 exclusion criteria. So, and we had these terminologies across the data sources, and we needed to find a common semantic base. So that meant that these events were translated to UMLS concepts, and that then could be mapped out to the different codes in the different terminologies. And here you see for those, for the terminologies, what the different level in granularity is. So for READ, it's the most granular terminology, whereas, for example, ICPC is much less granular. And that is what is actually causing the problems. Now, one of the key steps in doing this is also the evaluation of whether this makes sense and whether you have completeness. And that was a very tedious job and often took very long. So that is why in the IMI ADVANCE project, which we talk about a bit more later. This process has been optimized or semi-automated, and now there is like a tool which is publicly available. You can find the link here where you can plug in a case definition. It uses text mining to search the concepts in the UMLS and then maps it out to the coding system. So this has been optimized. Here you look at the results, some of the results of this SOS study. So basically what you see here is for different NSAIDs, traditional and COXIPs, you see their in the odds ratio. So it means that everything above 1 actually means an increased risk, and that is for current use of that NSAID against past use. And you can see here a nice ranking with the highest risk for ketorolac and indomethacin, etoricoxib, rovacoxib. So very nicely showing that across, pooling across those 7 data sources, first of all, leads to the results we would expect. So we can confirm that rovacoxib, dedicoxibs have an impact on myocardial infarction. What you can also see is that there was actually an opportunity and an ability across all those data sources to look at a large range of NSAIDs, which is often not done when you look at a single database where you may only be able to have, estimate the most frequently used NSAIDs. But this allowed us to actually have many estimates. Here is a similar table for heart failure, and again here you see the high risk for ketorolac, etoricoxib, rovacoxib, so very much confirming what we knew, but also having the ability to provide estimates for a lot of other NSAIDs that otherwise would not have been able to be investigated. What SOS also showed is that we would have wished to actually look at dose and duration effects or strength, and this was only possible in 3 databases because of the limited type of information that was actually available in the others. So clearly improvements that are possible would actually be to have a better ability to look at other details about a drug beyond the active ingredient only. Example 2 is actually about the IMI ADVANCE project, which aimed to build an ecosystem to monitor vaccines following the H1N1 pandemic. Lessons learned, which it's really needed to collaborate in Europe to monitor vaccines. And of course, why do I take this example? Because it's very topical. And this will also happen for COVID-19 monitoring, that we need to actually have an ecosystem. So many of the lessons learned from IMI are now going into the building of the ecosystem to monitor COVID-19. The way we worked in this project is actually the distributed analytics. All data access providers, they have their data local. They convert their local data into the common input files. Here, a patient file, a vaccination file, and a diagnosis file, very similar to what you saw for the SOS study, but now it's vaccination. And now you see here that there was actually a variable which called vac type, vaccine type, because many data sources were actually not able to even find an ATC code or a brand. We'll look into that. They had this, then they got a ARP program or a SAS program. They ran that, and the aggregated data were then shared on a remote research environment where people could connect to do the last analysis and pooling. So if you look at coding systems for vaccines, it's difficult. Here you see some where you could look at, but often you do not have enough detail to have all of the ingredients of the vaccine. So often we do know the type of pathogen or disorder it's actually targeting. Not in all strategies we know the vaccine strategy or the platform that is being utilized. So how is the antigen actually being presented to the body? Often in the ingredients are not always known, such as adjuvants, for example, in the ATC, and valencies are not always known in each of the terminologies. Now, this lack of detail on products will be really difficult for the COVID-19 monitoring. So I would really hope that we have IDMP and it will be recorded in some way. And here you see an example of like one of the vaccines that was being type of vaccines that were being looked at in the HPV in different data sources. So here you see the countries, the type of the data sources that were being utilized, the birth years included, the total persons, and then the information on brands. So Cervarix and Gardasil are the two key brands. And you see in many data sources, there is no brand known, actually. So only in very few you can actually know what type of vaccine is being utilized. So the way that we code medicines in common data models has evolved over time. And I would like to share with you the approach we're currently taking in the IMI funded conception project, which is about medicine safety evaluation during pregnancy and lactation. And within this project, we have been building a new common data model, which is has many more tables than the 3 that we were using initially. And the concept has also slightly changed, meaning that we distinguish 2 steps: a syntactic harmonization, so where local data access providers transform the data into a structure that has same variable names and table names, and then the semantic harmonization. And now we actually focus on doing the semantic harmonization more centralized, as it was difficult to see what was locally done if that is immediately done by the data access providers. So now within this common data model, you see, you have a persons table with observation periods, person relationships, mother, father, child, ability to have primary data collection linked, survey observations, medical observations, visit occurrence, events, procedures, and then most importantly here, a vaccines table, a medicines table, and a products table that can actually have details about the different products. And then there is metadata, the instance, and the source of the common data model. I'm just going to look further with you at the medicine and products table that is currently defined, and we're still working to finalize this. But you can, so this is the medicines table. You would have the person ID, the date of the dispensing, prescription, the product code, the local product code, the ATC code, and then this would be able to be linked to a products table where you have more detail on the product code, like almost like the pharmaceutical product actually. And so the key question that we are having now is whether IDMP would actually make this easier, or whether we could use these tables to immediately map to the IDMP, so that we can collaborate better and take the hurdle on the improved medicines harmonization across databases in Europe. So the conclusion for today is that medicines evaluation needs big data and access to multiple data sources across countries. We have learned that, and it's currently state of the art actually to do that. We also know that within Europe, data sources are very heterogeneous. There has been a lot of focus to overcome that heterogeneity and to deal with it through harmonization of event coding, but much less work has been done in medicines because it initially was possible to use ATC, but we are seeing that using only that is difficult in the vaccines, and often it also doesn't provide enough detail, and not the amount of detail that we would want to have. So I think that the next steps really, and that's why I think UNICOM is very exciting, is that we need to take next steps towards harmonization of medicines at more specific levels for these type of studies. Thank you very much for your attention.
Maybe just a quick rehearsal. So we had 3 examples. The first was on anti-inflammatory drugs and their effect on the heart. The second one was on tracking vaccines, and the third one was on medicine use in pregnancy. And as we learned, the current approach of using the international ATC classification is too broad, and IDMP can have a lot of added value to make these studies easier and more insightful. So that's my quick summary. Okay, so any remarks or questions while I will come back to the slides?
I suppose that the question for the presenter is around the products table, and are they going to use the standard terms that EMA are proposing for reference information and for organizations? That's the first part of it. And I suppose just an answer to the second question around the use of IDMP in such a data model, it's probably overkill to use IDMP, and most of the agencies that I've talked to are using subsets, and these are the regulatory agencies. Most of the agencies I've talked to are using subsets of the data within IDMP to describe product information. So that was just a comment.
Carl, can you perhaps, since Miriam cannot answer for obvious reasons, Carl, can you comment on this or?
These are, I think, very fascinating issues, but I think what she shows is how far we are away from harmonization of this data. And I already sent her presentation to our colleagues from ISO, to Christian and his colleagues. And they were also very excited about the presentation of Miriam, because it kind of underlines that IDMP was initially developed for dealing with pharmacovigilance reporting, has so many wider application fields which have not all been regarded so far, and which will probably keep the community busy for the next 10 to 15 years, I would assume. But you will see from my presentation also that this is a highly complex long-term process and nothing which can be done within a few years.
Okay, so I think we will move on. It's up to you. The next turn is yours, Carl. Let me quickly introduce. You are not only the UNICOM coordinator and senior consultant at Empirica, you also have a professorship in Victoria in Canada, and then you are a fellow of the Royal Society of Medicine, and you have already been the coordinator of the predecessor of UNICOM, which is Open Medicine, so highly qualified to run the show. So I will disappear again from the screen and will put your slides on.
Good, thanks for the introduction, Stefan. I should mention that co-organizer of Open Medicine was Jos de Vries, who is also online. You can see him actually. And Kevin Hoven, who is also listening, was also a critical part of that team. And I don't know whether other colleagues also are online. I think Catherine Kronaki is also here participating. So there are some others who were already involved in Open Medicine. And let me say hello to also some other colleagues, but not by name, who finally I see again. Good. I was asked to talk a little bit about data quality and semantic interoperability along the medicine data value chain. And what all of this means, you will see in a few minutes. If you just go to the next slide. And what we are talking about here is UNICOM. UNICOM is a European innovation action. It's not a research project. This is very important to understand. And I myself are very excited about this because it's not research you do, and which ends up in publications and on the shelf. But we hope to really change European healthcare systems a little bit by what we do in UNICOM. Next slide. And the overall goal of vision and mission of UNICOM is to help to ensure that any medicine and what it contains. And this is important. We have to know what in a medicinal product is contained, can be accurately identified anywhere in the world. And we are working thereby to improve patient safety and enable better healthcare for all. The initial idea for IDMP was developed indeed against the issue of patient safety. Colleagues who were working in pharmacovigilance in those days realized that they got information on side effects of medicines, which might even be deadly in some cases, but couldn't put the data together because they came from many different countries. The medicines had many different names. They came also maybe in different dosage forms or dosages, strengths, but they all had the same active ingredient basically, and they were creating harm to patients, and they couldn't put the information together easily and fast enough. And they probably could have saved lives and avoid lots of loss in quality of life to patients if they had been able to do this better and faster. And this, to my understanding, was about 15, 20 years ago, the basic idea to start developing IDMP to overcome some of these problems. And in the meantime, we then discovered there are various other application fields where IDMP hopefully will also be very helpful. Next slide. Okay, what is ISO IDMP? No, what is UNICOM doing in this field? We want to support not only systems like ATC or terminologies like INN, International Non-Proprietary Names, or ATC is the WHO code system for anatomic, therapeutic and chemical code system, that they are not detailed enough and sometimes have contradictions or inconsistencies in the systems, which makes them for certain use cases not useful, and which is also behind in UNICOM, we together with the Dutch, not we, our Dutch colleagues there, together with EMA and particularly also FDA, are developing a totally new substance registration system to get better structures into the active substances and other substances contained in medicinal products. And so IDMP will also support cross-border digital health services, particularly in the country. Global pharmacovigilance support are already mentioned and is lead to better healthcare and will also be used in public health and, for instance, in big data analytics, when we can indeed integrate data across many countries. So, and we focus on implementing IDMP at the regulatory level. We focus on adaptation of the already ongoing cross-border digital health services, particularly prescriptions, but it will also impact on patient summaries, because the coding of medicine data in IDMP will allow easier identification and understanding. And we explore various other fields to see where we see a new perspective once IDMP data are available. Next slide. Yeah, next slide. So I briefly define here interoperability, and I think Stefan will remember this. We more or less already had this kind of definition when 15 years ago we had the first e-health interoperability project, I2Health. And I said in those days I didn't even know how to spell interoperability, but that technical interoperability is not sufficient. And I recently had a nice quote from a German actor in the health field who said, in Germany, for instance, interoperability is mostly still understood as exchanging PDF documents. But we need much more, particularly at an international level. We really have to understand what is in these records. So linguistically, and remember we have 3 different alphabets in Europe. We have Cyrillic, we have Greek, and we have Latin alphabets. We have to be able to understand patient data, medicines data from other countries, and therefore we need this semantic interoperability. Indeed, to understand what is in the records or in a prescription, and to be able to act and to act together, even across borders coming from different languages and different medical cultures. Next slide. And that is what we do through IDMP. And the problem here is that we have various barriers to the free flow of drug information. One is we still have national markets for medicinal products. You see, European Medicines Agency has about 600,000 different products registered in the database, but most countries have about 10 to 20,000 only in the national database. So probability that the same medicinal products have been authorized in different countries is not that high, except for the common drugs. And the marketing strategy of pharmaceutical industry implies that quite often they apply only to 3, 5, 8 different countries and do not market their drugs across all member states. We have a big problem with data quality because of legacy data. You see, European Medicines Agency was created in the 90s, but I think it was Swedish colleagues who told me the oldest information we have from a drug which is almost 100 years old. So we have lots of old data which we have to bring up to date if we want to work cross-border on these kind of issues. Okay, let me summarize this. Data and medicines are probably the most widely used ones of any type of patient and health data, with the largest number of actors involved. And go to the next slide, you will see there the list of actors, and there are probably even many more actors. I will not read all these actors to you, you can read it yourself, but this shows you the tremendous amount of people involved in dealing with such data. Just go to the next slide. Yeah, next slide. And the ISO IDMP suite of standards is actually a set of 5 standards concerned with medicinal products and packages. Pharmaceutical products, I will come back to both terms in a minute. And the key aspect is, of course, substances. What is the active substance, or what are the active substances in medicines? And then pharmaceutical dose forms, units of presentation, and so on, and units of measurement, which I think are obvious that these must be standardized so we can understand it across different systems. Next slide. Yeah, I think we can leave this, go to the next slide. This is just a simple model. Okay, what is a medicinal product? This is a definition from the ISO IDMP standards. It's a substance or several substances administered to human beings. In UNICOM, we mostly deal with human beings, not with veterinary medicines, of treating or preventing disease. And a pharmaceutical product, this is a very important concept for interoperability, is the qualitative and quantitative composition of a medicinal product in the dose form approved for administration, and so on. And the notes are here important to understand this. A prescription by a doctor usually specifies a package and or the quantity of a medicinal product. In many countries, still by naming the brand name of a medicinal product. But different medicinal products, and companies have sometimes totally different names for the same product in different countries, may all contain the same pharmaceutical product. And this, if we can identify the underlying pharmaceutical product, will allow the doctors, the pharmacists, the patients to identify virtually the same or equivalent products which might have totally different names. Next slide. Okay, this is almost the last slide. These active substances, as I said, the Dutch colleagues and some other national agencies are building a new substance registration systems, which will be much more detailed than INN or ATC or what else we have at other national levels. And this will become mandatory for pharmaceutical industry. And this will be the core of the new IDMP compatible systems across Europe. And then we have to define strengths and reference strengths. And here we have the unified code for units of measurements, which are used to define these strengths. Here we globally agreed that UNICOM will be used. And on the administrable dose forms, the EDQM codes from the European Directorate for the Quality of Medicines and Healthcare of the Council of Europe will be used. And this demonstrates a little bit that just having a model, a standardized model, will not do. You have to have the concept for the attributes here of medicinal products. And then for each attribute, you still need a coding system that the standard doesn't give you. And you could even imagine that different countries use different coding systems. And this is the gist of semantic interoperability, which makes it so difficult to understand and so difficult to implement. Next. This we already know. I think that it will allow coordination, cooperation. So go to the next slides. And let's briefly discuss the benefits. This will really, once we have IDMP coded data, exchange and share data, like what the issues which Miriam was reporting on, many of them will be used in, I think, by adapting and further developing IDMP. Hopefully, most of them can be used. Pharmacovigilance reporting will definitely be improved. And the companies tell me, once we have this coded electronic data, we will never again have to retype the data. Right now, you won't believe it. These data are retyped manually at many interfaces. Cross-border dispensation will be improved, and so on and so forth, all what you can see here. And these are, in the end, benefits for European patients and for European health systems. I think that's it. Go to the next slide. Yeah, okay, here you can see where you find further information. It's all also on the UNICOM project website. And the last slide will be then the acknowledgements that whatever I report here is what UNICOM believes or what I believe, and has nothing to do with the opinions of the European Commission. Just show briefly the next slide, and then I thank you all very, very much. Yeah, okay, back to Stefan.
Okay, thank you indeed, Carl. Indeed, as Mark already wrote in the chat box, it's quite evident that it's a really complex matter to achieve interoperability in this domain. So maybe we offer just for one quick question for understanding, but just a quick one. And then we move on to the next presentation. We will then have the final panel for question and answers.
I might briefly answer to Diane's questions. We are working, or we have maps, but you see these maps to show on a slide are almost impossible. As you can see on the list of actors involved and stakeholders involved, these graphs get immediately very complex. And we still have to find a way to handle this. Robert van der Stichele is working on this for us. And one of these days we might have something better. Luc is helping. But it is incredibly complex. And I must say, I myself learned enormously about interoperability from Open Medicine and this project. I now understand the issues much more and why it's not happening. And like IDMP implementation will be with us for the next 15 or 20 years. And it's a ongoing activity. Other questions?
Okay, so maybe for the sake of time, I'm happy that we can then continue. We have now a national use case, data quality for patient safety in Belgium, ecosystems for coding and reporting medicine use. And here 3 people collaborate. Joost de Vries of Eurorec. He's a medical doctor for many, many years, or has been a general practitioner and one of the EHS pioneers in Belgium and in Europe. Dr. Robert van der Stichele, also a family physician and a clinical pharmacologist teaching at the University of Ghent, and Luc Nicolas, our colleague in EHTEL as EHS expert, and he has formerly worked at the Public Federal Service in Belgium for many years, so he knows the Belgium situation very, very well. So thank you, you 3, and I will move on to your presentation.
Thank you, Stefan. So I will begin, and then Jos will take over. So next slide, please. Well, actually, we speak about interoperability. One of the possibility to improve interoperability in a system is the concept of authentic validated source, because it's a source that everybody will use in a specific ecosystem. And in Belgium, we push that concept as much as possible, as we have sources for quite a number of things, like, of course, for identification of citizens, healthcare professionals, but also for medicines. And that has been a very important achievement. So a validated source contains actually unique and original data about person, concepts, or facts or flows. And the big advantage is that it guarantees the accuracy, the completeness, and the availability of this data to all the systems, part of the who are using and who are which are part of the ecosystem. This next slide, please. It aims clearly at trying to solve the question of semantic interoperability by providing a number of identifiers which will be used for a number of purposes. But it's also very much about organizational interoperability. Public bodies might be public, but the cooperation between, please, next previous one. But the cooperation between the public bodies is, in many countries, is a challenge by itself. So having 7 public bodies collaborating together around the same system has been quite an achievement. And here you can see that each of those entities, at least 5 of them, are responsible to provide data in the Belgian medicines authentic sources. And those data then will be used for several purposes by the end users, which are many, and this for a number of use cases. So here, what the authentic source actually, that's true, that's complex to do that. But actually what we wanted is to have something which really could be used and which would cover 2 domains, I would say. I mean, the administration level and also the clinical domain. So actually we brought together all the information we needed in order to work as a doctor, as a pharmacist, and also to work within the Belgian health system. So to apply the rules linked to reimbursement and so on. So all the authorized medicines in Belgium are in there. And we see that even drugs which are out of the Belgian market might also be in there, but the data are the main data suppliers are actually 3 organizations: the Belgian National Agency of Drugs, the National Institute of Insurance, and the CBIP, BCFI, which is an organization, an NGO actually, an organization in charge of defining the scientific knowledge about drugs. The main purpose was to support e-prescription when we designed these databases, first of all, but as we will see, it can be used for quite a number of other things. Next slide, please. So I will go very quickly into that. When we developed it, we had to take into consideration the requirements from quite a number of angles. And for example, in the clinical domain, we wanted to make sure that the ENN prescription was possible. It had to be possible to deal with allergies, intolerances. The doctors should be able to manage a substitution list, and all the legal aspects, including those linked to reimbursement, also quite a number of other aspects, which are sometimes very, very, very specific, had to be also included. Next slide, please. And that will be, then I'll pass over to just after this, sorry. The general architecture of the authentic source actually is meant to be totally independent from users and suppliers. That's the big advantage. So it imposes itself to all the clients of the system, but it's also a logical, it has been built in such a way that it's flexible and scalable. So it can adapt to future evolution or to future needs. It's built in a very, very generic way. And also we try to make it work so that it optimizes performances. I will not get into detail as we are quite late already, and I pass it over to Jos.
So the evolution from SAM2 to SAM3 was an occasion to improve the quality of the data regarding medicinal products. And there are some new features in SAM3 who are promising. So they made a distinction between the actual medicinal product and the virtual medicinal product. The actual medicinal product is in open medicine called medicinal product. The virtual one is called pharmaceutical. Actual products have a brand name, has a name and a brand name, not mostly brand name, but also branded generics, and are authorized only complete when on the market. So we have Flamoxin, soluble tablets, divisible, Solutab, 500 milligrams. It's very, very specific. And you have the generic level, the virtual level you have, and the generic brand name independent way are described. So you see here the composition of the different identifiers. There are a lot of identifiers included inside the new medicinal database. And one of the most interesting ones is the VMP. It's very similar to the pharmaceutical product ID. So the pharmaceutical product ID is the one we promote and we are convinced are essential if you want to have interoperability, not only cross-border, but also cross with decision support. We will have in the near future very important and more important decision support integrated in the clinical systems. And this will have to be based on an identifier. And the IDMP, who is not the same as the VMP, but the concept is the same. There is one identifier at the product, the tablet of 400 milligram carbamazepine, without the name, without the country, without the price, without the authorization, nothing, naked, the naked product. And that's what we need to have. And the purpose is finally, when I go to the end of the presentation, I will have one big statement. Let's record the IDMP, or let's record the pharmaceutical product ID inside the prescription. You have the package ID, you have the product ID, and you have the pharmaceutical product ID. If this is included into the prescription, you have at least comparable data between the different systems, between the different providers. So when we move a little bit further in the presentation next, so when you have the hierarchy, you have, there are two systems to describe it. You have the VMP-based system and the open medicine-based system. So you have a medicinal product package. So in fact, you have a substance. Where it's put in a virtual medicinal product or pharmaceutical product. All the products will have the same pharmaceutical substance, pharmaceutical product or a VMP group. And the AMP is the actual medicinal product, is the factual product. This is national, or it may be national. This is universal. There is no difference between the carbamazepine in Germany and the carbamazepine in South Africa or even in Zimbabwe. So it's still the same carbamazepine. But this is international and independent from the countries. And you go to the next slide. A little bit similar, yes. It's again expressed in a similar way, a more clear way. But next slide, yes. Okay, actual medicinal product represents a physical package, has a unique ID, has a prescription name, has contains brand in pharmaceutical form, proprietary suffix, package size, and so on and so on, has commercialization data, includes supply problems, include every delivery problems. It can't be used for everything that is factual on the package level. Next slide. The actual medicinal product represents a unidose. So this is what we call the pharmaceutical product. It represents a unidose of a brand. The actual unidose of a branded product is linked to one or more AMPs, has a unique ID, has an official tag named Flamvaccine, Solitop 500 milligram, has a license holder, pharmaceutical holder, and so on. All these attributes are in the database from the SAM database. Next slide. This is again the same overview. Next slide. The virtual medicinal product, or go to the previous one, please. Yes.
Sorry, did I go wrong?
Generic but specific enough for receiving generic prescription history and medical records, suggesting alternative products, informing of problems of commercialization, enhancing medicinal healthcare record processes, and so on and so on. All this is based, can be based on the virtual medicinal product. Next one. Visual medicinal product, amoxicillin 500 milligram without anything, represents a group of virtual medicinal products is a generic IMI prescription and price composition of similar VMPs. Is linked to one or more VMP, has a unique ID, shared properties for group for subnormal sharing, same moiety, standardized strength, and more abstract form and method of administration, and so on and so on. All these are attributes who are at the level of the virtual medicine product or the pharmaceutical product. Next. Scalable physical model, independence between structure of the business entities and the physical entities, the standard data, and so on. So the ISO IDMP compatible. What are still the constraints and challenges? Implementation of the physical model specific to each and a user based on the business entities. This is, of course, some three databases. Is the authentic reference database, and users are using a subset of it and are using a subset of the overall SAM database. Semantic standards are not yet traveling over the whole value chain. Access to complete content of medicinal products, enabling the allergies management and issues warning, for instance, no sugar, no milk, no lactose, and so on. All different tax stations are still to be done, and it's not solved the problem. Individual doses management, so it's also required, and including ISO IDMP. There is a resistance to change, but it's enforced. So, next slide. We have here the European international domain is this one. This is the national domain, and the ISO IDMP is the bridge between specific data and generic data, the qualitative data, and here specific factual data. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Just so this is the that's now the close of the presentation. I understand. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. What is important, I think, to remember from all this is that actually there is a lot of work of investments to be done just in order to try to standardize one medical data, which is a central one, as Carl has mentioned. And if there is not sufficient work to be done at national level and of course at European level, the creation of a European data space will face very important limitations, or will require very important work in order to rework the data for them to be usable. So at national levels, we have a number of ecosystems which can work on data use and reuse. At European level, and we've seen with the first presentation that it was needed to go across borders, we need to go better. We need to do better. And we also need to share the investments. So this between national authorities and European and international bodies.
Okay, thank you, Luc, for this additional clarification. Okay, okay, it's really challenging to see how much work in detail is necessary to come to this common language in the domain of pharmacy, and good to see that Belgium has an encouraging example that is even used from other countries, as I understand from your comment, Luc. Okay, so I think it's fair then to leave a little bit of time to Robert, and so I pass now immediately the floor to him. See also no additional remarks in the chat box. So Robert, you have already been introduced, and you have to, as agreed, you have prepared a short statement also to introduce the panel from a clinical perspective. So over to you.
Very shortly, trying to resume what we all heard, is that we have in Europe a great number of national drug dictionaries. We have 28 countries, 24 official languages, 2 or 3 or 5, even 5 drug databases in each country. And all these drug data dictionaries have their own clinical data model. Yes. The idea is now to, next slide, to connect all these databases with their different models to one global univocal identification system, and that is IDMP, and more specifically, do that connection on a global level with the pharmaceutical product ID, which is the cornerstone of the whole construction. And when that is done, and when it is possible, and it will be a shared national and global activity, then we can step to the next step. Next slide. We can also harmonize the national medicinal product drug models. Next slide. So that the models in these national, by which drugs are represented in each of these national drug dictionaries, become much more harmonized, much more similar, in short, semantic interoperable. And if we then go to the next step, that we can integrate this whole binding principle of national drug dictionaries to, on a more intellectual level, with all the international drug classifications, with the ATC, with the SNOMED data model, with the table of content of the BNF, with the knowledge databases and decision support systems that use drug classes. If we can interconnect that all in a very specific and precise way, life could become easier and also more fascinating. Next slide. So the advantages of univocal identification of medicinal products from an international perspective are 3 elements. First of all, they permit cross-border migration. If you prescribe a product in country A, it can go to country B and be valid there. But it also allows migration of knowledge databases on drug information and decision support developed in one country to be applicable in other countries without too much ado. It allows cross-national comparison. We can compare our drug dictionaries, our therapeutic arsenals We can compare the drug utilization, we can compare the quality of prescribing and dispensing in the different countries, and learn from that. And this comparison is done based on solid grounds, a common methodology. And last, and that is what Miriam spoke about, is cross-national cooperation, the ability to put all these data from all these countries together in the European data space, and hence facilitate multi-center, multinational pharmacoepidemiology. So that's, in short, the resume. Diana Whitehouse and Persephone already pointed out in the chat to the necessity to explain these complex objectives, to visualize them, and to make them clear to the end users and the stakeholders. And that's not an easy task, as you will understand. So any comments from the floor?
And if I may, so that's really, was really a wonderful summary. Thank you for this. And I invite now everyone also to switch on his camera again, if he has one, so that we can do this final panel facilitated by Rob. So maybe I start with a quick question. Robert, how in the cross-border migration, how do you see the practical impact on cross-border prescriptions as they have now been defined by the European guidelines and are in the CEF project, for instance?
Well, UNICOM project will, in 3 or 4 of its work packages, will set up a number of pilot products just to show that it will be possible, and that UNICOM project will, in 3 or 4 of its work packages, will set up a number of pilot products just to show that it will be possible, and that dream of a migrating prescription from one country to another. So UNICOM is partly paying for the piloting of this.
Okay.
Can I ask a basic question, in fact, and that's on your first slides, Robert.
Yes.
Where first slide, but third or fourth iteration of the slide, where
Yes.
you are concluding that national databases need to be harmonized.
Yes.
Can we? It's perhaps a stupid question, but can we simply consider that what matters is to have something in between that enable interoperability, and that enables still the national database to remain as they are? I can understand that there are values to harmonize or to step by step have something
As Carlo has said,
but I would expect that this would be kind of a side effect of the situation and not a precondition to create interoperability.
I agree with your remark. As already stated by Carlo, this is a long process that will probably go step by step and in some parallel ways. I think linking up the national databases to the pharmaceutical product on a global basis is the first step, and then what the countries then do with it and harmonize their own databases. These are not simple processes; they take months and years to do that. But somewhere in the presentation of Jos, you have seen that file with all the different identifiers on one page: the local identifier from the country, and then an international identifier. And this kind of portfolio of identifiers will buy the national authorities some time. This is a sort of intermediate solution that will give them the possibility to migrate to this harmonized drug model at their pace.
Yeah, that's exactly the point, at their pace, so that everyone can decide whether to go, when to go, and how to do it. And then there is no need for further European coordination and a complex process, because every country or every member state works at its own pace. Yeah, okay.
I think the problems are so complex that everybody will be pleased with some European coordination.
However, there's some element I think to take care of that EMA. So of course, still the majority of drugs is authorized at the national level, but also a significant fraction is now, I think 1/3, if I'm not wrong, is authorized directly by EMA. And the authorization by EMA is subject to using IDMP in the future. So actually there's no way out not to harmonize and not to use the European and international codes. Maybe some of the experts can comment on this.
Careful, guys. Can I intervene here? It depends on the term harmonization. What do we mean? Harmonization will not mean the national databases have the same software or same implementation.
No.
This will be specific and depending on each country, on each agency. But we need to agree, like on the data models. We need to agree on the coding systems, like for indications, MEDRA will be used. For dosages, EDQM will be used, and everybody will have to use the same coding system. All we need in some instances mappings between two systems, otherwise it will not work. And the technical implementation is another step where EMA is collaborating with HL7 FIRE resources to develop those resources for the technical implementation. And again, as long as every national system can produce these data from what they have, then they can exchange the data. And the key must be to have the same contents in a format which can be changed and where we can integrate the data, but where we do not need to harmonize national systems, except on the agreed implementation manner and the coding systems.
Yeah, it's harmonizing of the drug models and not of the systems. Yeah. Okay. Any other questions from the floor?
Well, less me than, in fact, Jacqueline Surug, who is Vice Chair of the International Federation of Pharmacy, had a comment and question, and there was a dialogue starting with Persephone Dupi. So I thought it was well worthwhile bringing them in.
Okay, so the problem is with this new class of non-biological complex drug, they are very strange composition. Usually they are nanoparticles, and those nanoparticles are put in a sort of, how can I say, envelope, which is very complicated. It's an envelope made of plenty of different sugars, like the saccharose and all the declination of different sugars. And the problem is then when you make them, they never do the same geographical composition. It means that the nanoparticles are there, the sugars, the different sugars are there, but the form is never the same. And so they are not acting always on the same way. And it's only by their clinical attributes that you can define them. So they are very complicated products. Even when you have the same temperature, same conditions, when you manufacture them, they are different. So it's a very complicated class, and I wanted to know how we could proceed with such a difficult product to characterize.
Well, Alfonso Tres, the Spanish king, said at a certain moment, if I was God, I would have made things less complicated. But the reality is that drugs can be some classes of drugs can be extremely complicated. It will always remain, the IDMP has gone, I think, already as far as possible in this, but the labeling of marketing authorization will always remain the beacon for the more detailed information on extremely complex situations. And for some biologicals, the production process can be determined for the efficacy. Here you speak of the spatial construction of nanoparticles. These are exceptions. I think if in 4 years we will be ready with the simple medicinal products, that will be already a big achievement. Of course, we have to deal with the complex ones, but they are at this moment still a minority of the problem.
Okay, thank you, Robert.
That would be my answer.
Thank you.
So maybe we continue with a question that is in the chat from Persephone. She writes, the forthcoming joint action on the European Health Data Spaces coordinated by Finland is set to deliver within 2 years, starting early next year. What would you see as a realistic output, viable result in the area of semantic interoperability data quality? So, yes?
I think as long the longer we wait to include something like the pharmaceutical product ID inside the prescription in the societal medication in the medical records, the more we will have data that cannot be used with decision support, that cannot be used cross borders. Why can't we not include already or foresee that in the prescriptions we should add pharmaceutical product ID as soon as possible?
Yeah.
Okay.
I think the research world, as Miriam has shown, is fully occupied with developing common data models. They are at the moment not very granular and still a bit rude, but they're fitting a purpose. And I think it's important if we want to go to the deeper levels of granularity, and IDMP has that promise, that it is important to do it right and not to be hurried by impossible deadlines. IDMP has a clear plan for the next 3 and a little bit more years. And in the meantime, I think the research community, pharmacoepidemiologic real-world data can pick up those achievements that have reached maturity inside the project, but only then and not earlier.
Okay.
Okay. Well, I have basically written what I had in mind. I have more questions than answers. It's just that I have been following the preparation of that joint action, and today's discussion was in a sense a breath of fresh air, because I was listening to people who really understand the problems, and in the context of preparing the joint action, I have a lot of difficulty explaining why this is an extremely hard problem to address within such a limited time space. So with this question that I presented to you, I was trying to get some hints how to bridge these two worlds. And I hope that some of you are going to be actively involved in the joint action in some way or the other, so that this experience that has been already gathered through the projects that were presented today can fit directly into what is going to be taking place there.
Persephone, to talk about semantic interoperability as such doesn't make any sense. I learned you have to talk about for what purposes, in which context, for which kind of data do I need semantic interoperability. Look at EPSOS, just the patient summary, how much work was involved in doing this. Today you got an understanding of just for medicinal products, how complex this is. So you will, I think, have to look at specifics, maybe at a specific clinical, maybe just cardiology or so, or just patient summary or prescriptions, and solve semantic problems there. I learned early into this game that mostly colleagues said focus. And like SNOMED has, I don't know, 500,000 terms. For a normal application, for a specific purpose, you might be 20,000.
Can I just add a little thing? I think I pretty much agree with you, Robert, in one thing, is that actually, well, we need to use what is mature, not to aim that everything is solved, because it will never be. And actually, it will be much easier to create European data space when we have member states who have all something, and who can, with member states who can already refer to something which is in development, than just dealing, as we have now, we've seen the examples with the first presentation, with multiple databases, with multiple data models, with multiple choices. So we need to reduce complexity and to have at least a vision in order to begin to build this. And to answer to you, Carl, I agree with you that actually semantic interoperability per se doesn't mean anything in a way, but as a public authority, actually you need to look at what you need to put in place in order to support all possible use cases. So it's not only at the operational level you look at one specific use case, but when you develop an infrastructure, you need to look at all which could be developed, and you should be able to support it. So you see, that's again, yes, it's very complex to model medicine, but we need to try to reduce complexity where it's possible.
With these wise words, I would close the discussion session and pass it over to Stefan to close the webinar.
Thank you very much, Robert. Still allow me one word of content here. So I think the agreement was now on focus, have a clear scope, so there can be made progress. And there was a second element, point made by Persephone, which was pharmaceuticals and particularly vaccines will be a hard topic to bypass when building the EHTS, giving the COVID urgency. And indeed, I think that's a good track because around COVID, there have been complex data sets, but complete data sets across all, let's say, nomenclatures and codifications defined around COVID. So we have now examples of this, what can be done with a strong focus, and maybe something could be added to the report of today's meeting. So otherwise, I would let me move on to the next steps, which is just to announce upcoming dates. We have from EHTEL, we have a digital integrated care task force meeting on 1st of October, deep diving into health data ecosystems. And from the side of UNICOM, we have an upcoming UNICOM community of expertise, which, seeing today's discussion, is from the level of complexity and insight quite similar to what we discussed today, which is gap analysis about existing and new standards and profiles. And then we are looking forward to the EHTEL 2020 Thought Leadership Symposium, which has now been titled Digital Services in the Move Towards Healthy and Resilient Communities. And this will be, as it is today, be virtual or hybrid, we would say, with some people on site, and will be held on the 2nd and 3rd December on second half of the days in the afternoon. Like I've shown earlier, we are publishing the recordings of the webinars to the website, and there's also an effect sheet upcoming on this webinar. So there will be room for rehearsal and room for a written discussion, and maybe we will also revisit EHTS. Will be definitely revisited at the symposium, so there will be opportunities to come back to the subject. So with this, I thank you very much for your active participation, and looking forward to meeting you at other events. Thanks a lot.
Thanks a lot. Goodbye.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you, everybody, for those.
Thank you, everybody.
Stay until the end. Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Bye.